First of all, yes, just to let you know, we are recording the meeting as always, and we will be uploading it to our website for anyone who wants to relive the experience, or if they miss it and if you want to share it with other people, you can do that too. So today we are going to be discussing Cambridge Doughnut Economics, which is, as many of you will be aware, back in January 2018, we hosted the Imagine 2027 conference, and a part of that included a talk by Kate Raworth on her developing concept of doughnut economics, which has now taken off around the world, and there are many cities that are trialing it, including Amsterdam and Portland and so on. And we're very pleased here tonight to have with us here Geraint Davis, who is working with a member of Cambridge Doughnut Economics Action Group. He joined them, helped shape the strategy. They're a group of very capable people who are trying to develop the Cambridge Doughnut model for the city. And this, I think you started doing this, I don't know how long ago was it now? Was it about a year ago that we started talking together? And I know that not just ourselves at Cambridge Commons, but also Cambridge 2030 have been in discussions with Cambridge Doughnut Economics Action Group, exploring ways in which we can work together and kind of add value to each other's activities as well. So Geraint is the director and co-founder of Innovia, a very accomplished physicist and strategist and consultant. And he, I'm sure I don't want to give away too much information about you, but I'm sure you'll be able to tell people more about yourself. But I hope that will do as a brief introduction. And we're going to try and stick to our 1 hour time limit. So I will just welcome Geraint and ask you to kick off. And I know you've got some slides which you'll be able to see on the screen. So thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. I think I'm not going to say too much about myself, other than to say, don't worry about my name. Everybody calls me G. It's much simpler. And there are other members of CamDEAG, the Doughnut Economics Action Group, on this call. So I'm sure they can help me out in some of the question and answer sessions. There's a lot more going on than I know about, so I'll fill in some of the basics, and then if there are any questions, we can cover that in the questions and answers. So I just want to start out with some caveats before I get going. The first is that I'm not. If you come to this call to find out what is the answer to, for example, the Cambridge housing problem or biodiversity in Nine Wells or Cambridge water issues, I'm not going to give specific answers. And in fact, economics doesn't give specific answers. It gives principles by which to work towards answers. And I'll talk about how that works. So no specifics. We won't be focusing on specific issues today. The second thing is that some of you may say, well, we know all this stuff already when I get to the end of the talk, and others may say, oh, this is just a fantasy. But I hope there's enough people that are between the two that this is useful. I don't think it's a fantasy. I give some personal views at the end, which are not necessarily, they are my views. They're consistent with Kate Raworth's Doughnut Economics, but I don't think they're fantasies. Third thing I just want to say is I'm recovering from something that almost looked like COVID, but has been a cold, and I'm working on the power of Lemsip Max at the moment. So forgive me if I sneeze or I'm a little bit hoarse. So Cambridge Doughnut Economics Action Group has a mission to promote an economy based on doughnut economics in Cambridge. And there are several different ways to do that and several different levels of what doughnut economics can represent. And I'll talk about that. The other thing I want to say is that what I'm saying today, what I'm going to talk about today is not just inspired by doughnut economics, although I do focus primarily on that. But there's many authors who've written about similar things or whose views contribute towards Kate Raworth's book. Some of those are quoted here. And I think they're all fantastic books to read. In fact, I want to thank Tariq for alerting me first to the Spirit Level, which he was reading when I first spoke to him. So I can recommend all of these books. There's fantastic stuff in each of them. One thing to notice is the dates of publication. I know some of these are second editions, but broadly, a lot of this thinking has arisen in the last 20 years. So it's quite recent stuff, and so some of it seems a bit radical, but there's a consistent body of movement in this direction from a number of different authors and indeed from a number of different governments. So now it's not, why is this not moving forward? Sorry. Okay, so let me summarize what I'm going to talk about in just one slide. And particularly focusing on the doughnut economics aspect of things. So first of all, what doughnut economics does is it gives us some new targets for what society should focus on, which is based on what's important now in the 21st century. So it recognizes that the 21st century is different in some key ways from what has gone before, and that we need to rethink economics for the 21st century. The way that is done is it's based on some new principles. Those principles can be applied to the ways that we carry out our activities in the community and how we treat the planet. And I'll talk about how some of those can be applied at the city level. Doughnut economics also applies at a larger level, and it gives some new perspectives for us on how to structure not just economics, but also politics, the basis of power, and our social norms and our institutions. And in fact, it focuses on the Anthropocene. And that's a really useful word. It carries a lot of weight in just that one word. Many of you may know what the Anthropocene is. If you don't, it refers to effectively a geological epoch that has been coined for the time when man has been able to, mankind has been able to significantly impact the planet. And of course, we're in that now, and there's various theories and arguments for when it started, but you can imagine it might have started around the middle of last century. So the Anthropocene is quite a recent era, but it's accelerating really rapidly. And recognizing that we are in that geological era and that we have to do something about it in the way we structure, the way we deal with each other and the way we deal with the planet is really important. Now I'm going to cover all these 3 points that are on here quite quickly because there's a lot to get through in 25 minutes. But if there's specific topics of interest, we can come back to those in the question and answer session. Let me see if I can have to advance the slides a different way than normal. So first of all, the set of targets. So we refer to these as the doughnut. And what the doughnut contains is a set of social targets and a set of ecological targets. And they're laid out on one page and in one mind space. And what we have to do, the inner circle is the social targets, which are based on the UN social development goals. And various embodiments of the doughnut show different ones and in different places, but broadly there's around a dozen or so social goals. And we want to have those as, these metrics should be as big as possible. We want to maximize the social metrics to go beyond what's called the social foundation. And the planetary metrics around the outside are based on mankind's impact on the planet. And we want to minimize those so that we're not overshooting what the planet can sustain, so that we keep within the ecological ceiling. And between the ecological ceiling and the social foundation is what we call the safe and just space for mankind. And one of the most important things to recognize about these targets is that we don't include GDP growth in there. And GDP growth has become recently a key target for governments and for societies. And what the first lesson that Doughnut Economics has is to replace GDP growth with this much more sophisticated set of targets, which are focusing on a whole range of social issues and a whole range of ecological issues. I won't talk about the individual aspects of the donut. We can do that later if that's important. But examples include equality of the society, which is typically measured in terms of income equality, access to water, access to energy, and things like that. And then on the outside, we have obviously things like climate change, but also ozone depletion, fresh water withdrawals, and a number of other things. So the ecological impact doesn't just focus on climate change, it focuses on a wide range of metrics. And you can set ways to measure each of these things, and then map out what they look like, how different countries are doing against these metrics. And here are some examples of those, which come from the University of Leeds, where they have a unit which focuses on measuring progress against the donut in different countries. So you see in the UK, we're largely okay in terms of the social thresholds, but we exceed a large number of planetary boundaries. So we're not doing terribly well for our ecological footprint. In the middle is Costa Rica, which, why don't I focus on Togo first? So you can, and the number there in dollars is roughly the GDP per capita. So the UK at roughly $50,000 per capita GDP exceeds the planetary boundaries. If you look at Togo, which is only $2,000 per capita, it's fine on all the ecological boundaries, but it's not very good on the social ones. So it's falling way short on a load of social measures. And in between, somewhere around the $20,000 mark, an example from Costa Rica, which is just about right on all of them. Exceeds some of the planetary bounds a little bit, falls short of some of the social ones a little bit, but it's got roughly a right mix. And I'm going to come back to that $20,000 per capita number later on because it's quite important. So this talk is about Cambridge, or at least partly about Cambridge specifically. So what's special about Cambridge? Well, first of all, as many of you know, it's one of the most unequal cities in the UK, and the UK is one of the most unequal developed countries. So Cambridge sticks out rather in terms of social inequality, and this is a personal opinion, but it's choking itself with growth. So it's ecologically, it's not doing terribly well. So in some senses, Cambridge is a worst case example, particularly for social inequality in the developed world. Why is that? And we've heard several talks about this here, and I'm sure this is no surprise to Cambridge Commons talks. It's largely because of the economic growth of Cambridge. And for many, the economic growth of Cambridge is a great thing and is a solution. But in fact, it's more likely a problem, and a problem which is leading to a lot of this inequality. I hark back to Deborah Potts' very, very good presentation here a couple of presentations ago, which was about the fact also that it's the investment market which is creating a lot of problems with housing. So how the provision of housing is not really a market for homes, it's a market for investment, and that's part of the problem. At the same time, Cambridge is well known for innovation. So in principle, we should be able to do something about this, and Cambridge is a great test bed for trying out some of these ideas. So that has led to the foundation of CamDEAG, which is aiming to work on some of these problems. So this slide is, I need to back off a second because that slide is a big mouthful all in one go. So, What I'm going to talk about, first of all, there is the principles. Where the Doughnut Economics has a set of 7 principles, and those principles can be applied at different levels. I'm going to talk about how they can be applied at the city level. And some of the examples I'll give will be all existing examples of initiatives which are already taking place in Cambridge, which are completely or largely aligned with the principles of Doughnut Economics. And also I'm going to indicate some that are being run by and have been started or are being participated in by Cambridge, by CamDEAG. So this is probably the busiest slide. Forgive me for the huge number of words on it. I'll first of all talk about the principles, and then I'll talk about how they can be applied at the city level, and particularly in Cambridge. So the first one is embrace the Doughnut goals, the goals which we were just talking about a couple of slides ago. Examples of that, CamDEAG is working with the City Council to create a city portrait which measures and displays these metrics for how Cambridge is performing against the Doughnut metrics. And we're also working to create a Doughnut economic-based decision tool for some of the City Council's decisions that it makes in the normal day-to-day business. The second principle of Doughnut Economics, and I'm summarizing these somewhat and simplifying some of them for them to make them a bit more easy to understand without going into a lot of detail, is to recognize it's what's called the embedded economy, and partly it's about recognizing that the economy is embedded within the planetary system, and that the economy is not a thing that exists in isolation of the effects of the economy and the externalities which the economy creates in the environment. Partly about that, but it's also about recognizing new economic roles, or at least recognizing roles which have existed for a long time but haven't been really taken account of properly in economic theory, which is the roles of the household and the roles of the common and the role of the commons. So, for example, the roles of the household is to create largely well-formed human beings to go out into society, and it's recognizing that there's a huge amount of economic value in bringing up families, in bringing up children, and also that there's a huge amount of economic power which can come from the commons, and that's separate to the state and it's separate to business. So it's really introducing, as well as the government and business, which are what we generally tend to talk about in terms of economic roles. It's recognizing the power of the commons and the household. So examples of how this can be applied are in community-based currencies like camlets, in citizens' assemblies, in community-owned resources, for example, and in structures like participatory cities, which aim to involve the community and to give ownership of certain key assets to the community. The third principle is called nurture human nature, and it's about a couple of things. Partly, it's about recognizing both the delicate and the weird aspects of human nature, both about nurturing people, but also recognizing that economic decisions are not necessarily made on a very rational basis, because people ultimately are not rational beings. But also nurturing things like collaboration, reciprocity towards one another, participation, and in particular, community. So things which can bring communities together and and share community resources, like the food hubs that have come up over COVID, the community fridge, the community kitchen in Cambridge, for example, creating libraries of things which can be owned by the community and which can be shared by members of the community, so that you don't do, so for example, we had lawnmowers in libraries of things. We wouldn't each have to own a lawnmower. We could borrow it from the community library of things. community markets, and shared community spaces for like Joy's Garden. The next one is to think in systems, and that contains a lot, and it refers mostly to the type of systems thinking which Donella Meadows is a proponent of. But it means watching out for things like feedback effects. And one of the key feedback effects in the economic system is the fact that wealth in itself is a means for generating income. Just the ownership of wealth creates income, which means that rich people get richer and poor people get poorer. So there's a feedback effect, amplify differences. But also there are some useful things in terms of what are called tipping points, which talk about what aspects of a system you can have most influence over the system by tweaking. And it turns out that the paradigms which the system is based on, for example, are the most important ones to work on if you really want to change the system, rather than changing individual parameters within the system. So, and I think Dorothy Potts' talk was a great example of this, where she said, she showed that the housing market was part of a broader investment system, which has impact, which reaches way beyond Cambridge into the international investment community, such that the international investment community, which is much bigger than the housing market, influences housing in Cambridge far more than the need for homes within the Cambridge area, so that we have a distorted market. And for example, ways you can deal with that are things like community housing trusts, and as I said, avoiding rich get richer, I wouldn't say schemes, but systems, and beware of single issue fixes as well, because I think one of the key lessons about systems thinking is it may look as though you are fixing one particular issue. For example, I don't want to pick something contentious, but they will all be contentious. You might be trying to fix biodiversity, but in the process of doing that, well, a good one is the housing market. You might be trying to fix the housing market in Cambridge by building more housing, for example. But in so doing, you might be perpetuating the economic system, which is the real problem, the growth market in Cambridge. And so you might be looking like you're fixing a problem, but you're making the driver of the problem far worse. So that actually the system, the problem is getting worse quicker than you can fix it, which is effectively what Deborah Potts was telling us in her talk. Next is distributive by design, which is things like creating open source architectures for knowledge, for intellectual property and things like that. So examples of that are employee ownership of companies, community ownership of companies, and a good example of this is the Cambridge Sustainable Food Hub, which is designed to be distributed. Then there is, and that distributive by design effectively applies to the economic side of things, and regenerative by design applies to the ecological side of things. So this is about stewardship. It's about sharing things in order not to have to create more of the same things, repairing them, recycling, regenerate. And regenerative by design refers to both the biological side of things, the ecological side of things, and man-made materials, which it calls the materials cycle. So examples of this would be organizations like Cambridge Reuse, FreeCycle, the repair cafes, make spaces, which are usually community-owned facilities, and products like Fairphone. And then the last one is about being agnostic to growth, making growth no longer a target, and aim to thrive whether or not we grow. And I guess the question, one of the key ways we can apply this to Cambridge is to ask, who is it that benefits from growth in Cambridge or from growth in any one particular aspect of Cambridge that we're focusing on? So that was a rather whirlwind tour. Let me jump on to say that there are a lot of organizations already doing a number of these different things. So although Doughnut Economics may sound like it's rather futuristic, actually there's a lot of it already going on in Cambridge. And I think that's really important to recognize. And there are lots of organizations you'll recognize around here. And many of these organizations are ones which CamDEAG is working with. All right, whoops, sorry, I skipped forward. So let me just talk briefly about CamDEAG. Our mission is to promote an economy based on Doughnut economics principles, and to empower individuals and organizations with the knowledge and the tools they need to create these kind of societies, a more social and ecologically just city. And there are three ways we do that. First is by reframing the economic narrative, and that we're working with, for example, local government in that. The second one is to influence strategic policymakers. And the third one is to collaborate with innovators and change makers to facilitate transformation in Cambridge. So those are different levels of working, and different people in CamDEAG are working on different ones, different aspects of those particular approaches. And I won't go into the details of all of those approaches, but we can discuss some of those in the questions and answers. So I want to close, but with jumping a little bit back to the big picture, referring again to putting all of these perspectives together, the planet, society, and the donut. And I just want to have a warning that what I'm going to say next covers quite a big picture perspective over a long time scale and averages across many nations. And the changes which are entailed in moving to a completely much more donut-oriented society are the sort of things that will take 2 or 3 generations, not 10 years. And they'll have to be gradually adopted, because if you look at them now, some of them look as though they're rather fantasies. But first of all, talking about GDP growth, which is what all governments and society is focusing on at the moment. So it works, but only up to a point. And one important thing to recognize, and for example, if you look at this chart here, I'm sorry about the chart is rather small, but if you look at life expectancy versus GDP per capita, what you see is that as GDP rises, life expectancy accelerates quite quickly, but then it reaches a point which is about when life expectancy is 75 years and GDP per growth is $15,000 US. Remember that number from Costa Rica, the one in the middle of the donut. Then it starts to slow down, so you get diminishing returns on life expectancy. It's still a good thing, but you get most of the benefit up to about $15,000 per capita. Now, an important thing to recognize is that beyond that point, actually, a lot of things start to get worse. So on the same chart, I've plotted the Gini coefficient in percent for a number of different countries. And as you can see, and this is my line that I put in there, but it gets a lot better up until about that tipping point. And then above that, it gets worse. So there is a sweet spot in income inequality. And that's one of the things I forgot to mention in the first slide. It was on the rubric that the GDP improvement below that level goes to improving health, which is really important. But above that, it tends to go to consumption instead. Now, why is inequality not a good thing as it gets worse, well, apart from fairness and so on, it turns out that a lot of other factors which measure quality of life also get worse as inequality gets worse. So effectively, beyond a certain level, society, the way that society works, tend to break down. So what happens is, and as Tim Jackson points out in Prosperity Without Growth, consumption also tends to be a substitute for the status of wealth. So the more inequality we get, the more consumption we get. And consumption requires productivity, it requires the use of energy and materials, and human activity, so we get a worse ecological impact. So broadly, the way I tend to look at this is that society grows up and is in a sort of childlike phase for a lot of the period of growth, up to a GDP of about $15,000, $20,000 per head. And beyond that, it needs to move into a different phase, which I call the adult phase. Now, I'm going to stop soon, and I don't want to overrun time too much, but let me just share a couple of slides quickly. So the first thing to say is that although climate change is a primary focus for us at the moment, and it's a very pressing focus, when you look at the rest of the donut and you recognize the impact on society of all of the other things that are going on, climate change is just the first thing that's going to hit us. We can see already the consequences of poisoning of the oceans, shortage of land, shortage of water. And as we saw under the last administration of the US government, there was a lot of social tension and we were starting to get social fallout. To balance those, we have, I don't want this to be about doom and gloom, but I do think there are a sequence of challenges that we face, and climate change is only the first one. In order to balance that, there are the principles of Doughnut Economics, which I've defined, which I've laid out on the right-hand side. But the key things that we need are systems thinking, as I've mentioned, not point fixes, to recognize that technology is an enabler, but it's not a solution in its own right. So for example, even if we manage to switch all of our energy production to green energy, one of the things that's laid out in Doughnut Economics is that the productivity in producing goods and everything like that is really, and all of the advances in productivity we've made, or the majority, more than 85% of the advances we've made in productivity over the last 100 years have been down to the availability of energy. So if energy is still available, it happens to be green, we will still produce loads of goods, but that will still have an impact on the planet. So we need to cut demand as well. And Tim Jackson gives some of the answers to how we have to restructure society and how we have to look at a new social contract. He talks about enterprise as service, about work as a form of participation. So you participate in the community, and that is how you define work. And the investment is not about making money, but it's about committing to certain types of thing and certain causes, and to forwarding certain causes. And we will also have to look at changing the rights of ownership, about changing what are the rights that business have over society, and the conventions of power and the conventions of status within society. So all of these things will need to change before we can create a truly donut economic society, or balanced society based on donut principles. So this is my last slide. And the question, this is a question that you might be asking, is this progress that we're talking about, or is it regress? And I said that the first thing I'd say is we have to remember why we're doing this. Many of us will be driven by the factors on the right-hand side. Some of us will be driven to avoid some of the things on the left-hand side. Either way, they work in the same direction. And what Doughnut Economics is not talking about is going back to a world, or going back to societies which have $15,000 worth of GDP growth, of GDP. GDP is only one measure of value. So what Doughnut Economics is about is going forward to a new society where the majority of the value in life is not measured in GDP. It's measured in all of the other factors that we were talking about right at the very beginning. And I mentioned this, the society, so people talk about growth and does it mean stop growing? And we talk about degrowth. Well, it's important to recognize there are different aspects of growth. So when children become adults, they stop growing in height, but they carry on growing in many, many different ways. This is about society changing from a childlike state to an adult state, where it recognizes the importance of stewardship, where it recognizes the responsibilities and impact on the planet. And yes, there's less of what we have now, but there's much more of some of the things that we don't have now or that are not working well in society now. So that's where I'm going to end. We can move to questions and answers, and I apologize that I've run over time a little bit.
Thank you very much, G. That was great, fantastic. A lot packed in there and a lot of food for thought. I was wondering whether you could put the slide back to the 7 principles. I thought it was quite a really interesting and fascinating slide. So we could look at that and maybe inspire some questions. So as anyone who's a regular knows that the way that we do these questions is that we ask people to write them into the chat and I'll take them in the order that they come. And don't make me ask the first question again, just to get you warmed up and going, but I will if I have to, all right? But I think there's so much in there, so much food for thought. I've learned a lot more about Doughnut Economics than I knew before. So I do have a couple of questions that I want to come back on. And of course, you can raise your hands as well, but the only problem is that I might miss your hand because there's so many of you. So don't be shy. Any questions? And while you're waiting to speak, then while you're waiting to think of a question, I will kind of ask my question. So I'm struck by the point that you were making about the need for system change and paradigm change. And I'm struck by the number of initiatives there are in Cambridge going on trying to fix kind of single issues. And one of the things that initiatives like Cambridge 2030 have been trying to adopt is the more kind of systemic approach and looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and trying to deal with that. But that sometimes feels like a really, really big job. I mean, how do you change a system? Isn't the way that you change a system a series of small changes that come together and make that system change? Can you really do it from looking at it from above and trying to kind of visualize it in this way?
I think both ways of doing it are good. So I absolutely agree that you have to do it by small steps, and those small steps can help to introduce people who might be more scared of the big scale change. But I do think somebody needs to be taking care of working out what the overall direction of that is. And that's the foundation of that is what Kate Raworth is laying out. I didn't say this explicitly, but Doughnut Economics is not yet a complete set of, not a complete template for that new society. It's just a foundation for it, and we need to build a house on that. And that's one of the things that I'm personally interested in. But as you say, making specific directed changes is important as well.
Thank you. So I haven't got any questions yet, which is kind of, Mike Dixon has, so Kerry Galloway has a question: how do we make this be more effective? And Mike Dixon's comment is, will the banks and financial world fund this type of development? They are currently obsessed with GDP growth and promoting mass consumerism. How do we win over the real power brokers, the money men, it's usually men, to adopt this approach?
That's a very difficult one. Partly, I think you communicate with them, and that's one of the things that Kate Raworth is doing. And I think Kate Raworth is very, very clever at making Doughnut Economics not too challenging. Because she leads with the idea that we have to focus on all these other goals as well. And I think that's a good way to influence some of the people at the top. Of course, it also it needs some of those people at the top to decide that they're going to do something about it as well. And you can see that happening. You can see companies like Unilever deciding to become much more focused in this way. So it's gradual change. And I think by showing that the sort of society that is represented by Doughnut Economics is not scary, the thing is, people mostly focus on what they think you are trying to take away. And I think one of the things that's important to do is to show the type of good things that will result from a Doughnut Economics type world. And that's the way to attract people into it. And it is a slow process, and it will take generations. It's not going to happen in the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you. Jules Lent has asked a question. So Jules, do you want to ask your question directly rather than me just listening to my voice all the time? If you're there, just unmute your mic and just ask your question.
Hello, lovely to be here this evening. Yeah, no, I was really interested in your, that international slide. Clearly there's different levels of opportunity, but I wondered whether, we can look at best practice case studies anywhere to learn how to do this.
Sure. And without wanting to be disrespectful to Costa Rica, they are not sitting in a great sweet spot in the donut because they have practiced Doughnut Economics for generations and are perfectly in the right place. They just happen to be at that point of their development when they're around that switchover point. So the countries which are actively pursuing Doughnut Economics, some of the CamDEAG members can probably help me out here, but New Zealand, for example, is actively incorporating it into national policy. I believe Ireland too. So there are more, and some of the Scandinavian countries are increasingly adopting some of the Doughnut Economics principles and bringing it quite central to policy making.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Adrian, who's Adrian French, who's given us a link to the Bennett Institute, which he's saying is regularly publishing on wellbeing and public policy. So if you want to find out more. And Mark Carrigan. Mark, do you want to come in and make your point about Marxism, which is always fun? Are you there, Mark? You want to unmute yourself and make your point? If not, Judith, can you give an example of how City Council might use Doughnut Economics, but how City Council might use Doughnut to suppose someone wanted planning permission for extension to a house? Would that be somehow discussed according to its effect on the donut? Good question.
It is. Ultimately, yes. I can't think right through the sequence. If there's anybody else from CamDEAG that wants to try and answer that question in specifics, I think, for example, I'll go to one of my favorite topics, which I must admit is influenced by my wife, who's Sam, who was one of our independent councillors and who focuses a huge amount of her attention on community. I think, for example, the way it might filter down is, in what way is the planned work going to contribute something towards the community, for example, or it might not have to contribute that, but that might be a more positive factor towards the application if that were the case. So I think we look at these systems, we look at these principles, and then we see, and the community is a good one, and potentially, the ecological aspects are already being included. But for example, there might be an aspect of, to what extent is the development regenerative in some way, or using existing materials. So there are ways it will filter through.
Mm-hmm. Mike Dixon has recommended Professor Jason Hickel's book Less is More, which he describes as superb, but we ought to be putting together reading lists, I think, for these meetings as well. We always get some fantastic recommendations from people. Mark is back at his computer, so Mark, I invite you to comment, make your comment on Marxism.
Well, yeah, it's not really a comment on Marxism as such. I just think, I mean, I find this really inspiring, but the previous point that was made about this could be presented to elites in a way that is not scary, that renders them persuadable. Taken to its logical conclusion, is there not a moment of confrontation here potentially? Because this is a threat to entrenched interests. The world is not the way it is because people see it in a kind of piecemeal way.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, yes, it is, and I think one of the things I often do is to recognize that there's a difference between away from motivation and towards motivation, and I think we just need we need to make sure that we give enough towards motivation that it can overcome people's recognition of the away from motivation. In other words, but wait a minute, I'm going to lose my SUV if this happens. By helping them to recognize that they're going to have a lot more friends or feel like they fit in a lot better. There is something else. There's another slide that I might share, which I put in the appendix, which might also help, which is about, can you see that? This is about creating change. And the way I like to think about both sustainability and doughnut economics is that we're jumping off an old S-curve onto a new S-curve. And if I don't know if people know about the innovator's dilemma, Clayton Christensen, who talks about innovation as switching between one S-curve and another. And what he says is that when you are approaching the end of one S-curve, jumping onto the next one looks like a bad move, because as I've drawn it here, you're going down instead of up. And so it looks like there's no sense in doing that. But the far-sighted people recognize that you're jumping onto the beginning of something which is going to go a lot higher. So persuading people that although there's a short-term penalty, there's a far bigger long-term gain is part of it. And also, there's another lesson in this, which is that typically the way to persuade people to jump onto a new S-curve is to create something which works for both the old and the new S-curve. And in this case, it's things like convenience and cost. So you put taxes on something so that if it's doing the wrong thing, it costs more. And people go, oh, well, I don't like doing that, but I'll do it because I'm part of the system, I'll pay the taxes. And so they start getting onto the new S-curve. And so first of all, it's about logistical reasons and purely sort of financial reasons. But then after a while, and if you can think about smoking, the smoking in public as a good example of this, where initially it was all about away from stuff, but after a while it became socially important not to smoke. And so social factors started taking over, and then that creates quite a tipping point, and more people do it. And ultimately, when you're getting to the top of the S-curve, you're led by values. And in fact, you can see companies along this spectrum as well. So I mentioned Unilever earlier on. They're very, very values driven. And there are companies that are along different parts of this S-curve in terms of their transition to more sustainable behavior. Sorry, that was probably a long, complicated answer, but I hope it gives some of the clues. It is going to be challenging. But change which is gradual can succeed.
Okay, so we've got lots and lots of messages and comments coming up now. So Myron, do you want to ask your question? I know some people are kind of listening with headphones and not necessarily in front of their computers. So I will come back to you if you want to ask your question. Rachel Morey, do you think that there is an issue with certain classes in the UK, specifically in terms of getting people on board with sustainability and these economic principles? Do you want to expand on that a bit, Rachel? What do you mean?
I've seen the question.
Yeah. Do you want to respond? Do you want to respond, G?
I don't want to get in trouble by entering a class debate. Definitely, as we were just discussing, some people are going to be affected in different ways from others. And obviously there are going to be people for whom this is more unwelcome than others. But You know, that's something we're gonna have to face, because we can't have half of society working in one way and the other half working in another way.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar thought in my mind about how this is something obviously that we can relate to in a place like Cambridge or Oxford or Brighton or Bristol, but how does it play in, a declining northern post-industrial town in the Red Wall, for example? Does there have to be a different vocabulary, a different way of expressing what we're trying to do here?
Absolutely, there needs to be probably a different vocabulary. I think actually it'll be more attractive to them because they've got less to lose and more to gain. I think Cambridge is the toughest place to try and introduce this. Luckily, we've got a tradition of innovation, and so that makes it a little bit easier. But in terms of the effect that it's going to have on people, Cambridge is a tough place to introduce this.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to skip a few comments because we're coming up to near the end of our time. So Mike Dixon asked, are there any political parties supporting donut economic policies? They all should.
They all should. I don't want to get into the political debate either. In Cambridge, it so happens that the Labour Party is supportive of donut economics. And at least one of our members is a Labour councillor. Some of them are also Green councillors. So, I mean, the Green Party obviously is very supportive of this. Other than that, I don't know how to answer the question. I mean, I think you can imagine the sequence of parties that will be the last ones to adopt this. But again, it is all a spectrum of adoption and people being willing to change their minds.
Yeah. And Cambridge Commons is a group that has people from all parties involved. So we hope that through these discussions we can start influencing thinking and kind of changing things from the ground up as well.
And that's the same for CamDEAG.
Yeah. So I think, again, I'm just scanning so I know, G, you said earlier you weren't going to comment on any specific developments in the region. Janie has asked, what is the CamDEAG reaction to the Oxford-Cambridge ARC housing? And obviously housing is a big issue today in the local press. Do you have any thoughts on that without necessarily kind of commenting on specific schemes?
I see it as, let me say how I see it. I think it's probably how CamDEAG sees it. We haven't discussed it in a great deal of detail, but I mean, it's part of the economic growth agenda, right? The ARC is really an excuse to build a whole load more houses, which is an excuse for developers to make a whole load more money. Which is an excuse for international investment to make the market even less accessible to everybody that wants to live here. So I don't think, I mean, yes, it's going to bring certain types of benefits, but I think it will bring a lot of problems with it.
Okay, interesting. And Cynthia Anand has mentioned that Cambridge Doughnut Economics asked election candidates the question back in May and got a few interesting responses, and she's given us helpfully the link so you can look at what election candidates have said. So is there anybody else, as we approach the last 4 minutes of our session, are there any other pressing questions that anybody wants to ask? So please do just come in and ask your question. If I've missed anybody, and Kerry, you're sending me lots of direct messages, and I'm not sure you're meant to be sending. You may be wanting to send them to everybody rather than just me. But you have commented that the people involved in the Oxford-Cambridge ARC are very committed to it going ahead. And as we know, this is an agenda that's driven from national government downwards. Yeah. And it's maybe something that, because of the denuded nature of local government these days, has little influence in trying to change that.
That's very, very true. And of course, you realize that national government is led by this GDP growth agenda. So it's what you'd expect, unfortunately. And you're absolutely right that It's very difficult for local authorities to do anything about that agenda.
Yeah. So again, we have always have great discussions in Cambridge Commons, and you know that there are lots of brilliant ideas, but I think one of the things that we always struggle with is how do we turn them into effective action. And one of the things I do like about Cambridge Doughnut Economics Action Group is that there are examples around the world of cities adopting this. How long do you think it will be before we see kind of noticeable change as a consequence of adopting doughnut economics in a city or a region around the world?
I think there are examples already in Devon.
Mm-hmm.
Devon Doughnut Economics is quite far forward, and I think they've got traction already in terms of noticeable change. Partly it will be dictated by that balance between local government and national government. And I think although a lot of local government may want to move things faster, they may be held back by national government. But you know, timescale, easily I would think within 10 years we will start to see some things which we can recognize as coming from doughnut economics in terms of local changes.
Yeah.
Maybe nothing very much.
Yeah. You know, one can argue that there are other systemic changes that also need to take place before, you know, the whole issue around the doughnut economics principles can be fully encapsulated, embedded. For example, electoral reform, the voting system and so on, you know, being able to give voice to people that are currently marginalized or not, or ignored in our current electoral system. What's your view on that? Do you see kind of European countries where there are more inclusive political systems being more progressive in this respect than Great Britain and the UK?
I'm not great on politics, but I would say that as most people would say, some of the Scandinavian countries have for a long time been much more oriented towards doughnut economics type policies. So broadly, ones which are careful to use a political word, more socially oriented, I won't say socialist, but more socially oriented, have been going in the right direction.
Yeah, okay. And Peter Zip has raised his hand. So Peter, do you want to ask a question or make a comment? We can't hear you, Peter. You might be muted. I can't see everyone on screen at the moment, unfortunately. So
yeah, he's muted.
Okay.
It might be about flat pack democracy.
Yeah.
And I think the answer is yes. And it needn't be under the doughnut barrier, but the doughnut will certainly support it, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got to 7 o'clock, and there's obviously plenty more that we could discuss around this. And you know, we'd love to have you or another member of CamDEAG back, you know, at some point in the future when we can kind of see how things have progressed and how things have moved on. Thank you very much, G, for taking the time for preparing the slides. I think it's been really fascinating, very interesting, and you know, all power to you. And you know, we will support you and work with you as much as we can to try and affect some of these principles. So I'm currently working on finding an interesting speaker for the October meeting, but I'm also planning ahead to looking at the December meeting as well, which will be hopefully on the 1st of December, when we're hoping to look at the concept of the overpaid executive tax, which is something that San Francisco has recently introduced, and looking at whether that's applicable in other places where you have very high rates of, well, certain people earn very large amounts of money and contribute to inequality. So look out for that one. Please do sign up for our newsletter on the website, the Cambridge Commons website. Follow us on Twitter, on the Facebook page, and also on Eventbrite as well, so you get notice of the meetings when they come up. So finally, just thank you again, G, and thank you to everyone for participating, and have a good evening, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.